Louis Crofts, Javier Espinoza, Samuel Stolton. Very warm welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. We meet for the second time, once a year approximately. I hope the tradition will continue. And obviously the main topic of today's conversation will be the election to the European Parliament. So let us start with reflecting on the results, the implications, and what should we take out of it. Let us start with Samuel.
Well, firstly, thanks for inviting us back, Olej. I'm surprised that you're having us again after our mess of a conversation last year, but we certainly had a lot of fun. So thanks for making space for us. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are any huge surprises in the EU elections. I think Germany and France are particular cases, but what we saw generally was a rise in votes for the far right and centre right. Europe's largest political family, the European People's Party, became larger. It now occupies, I think, 190 seats in the European Parliament. On the other hand, there were quite substantial losses both for the Liberal Front and the Greens across Europe. I think the picture is a bit more revealing when you do look at the two poles of economic and political power in the European Union, Germany and France. Of course, in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, the far right group, were the second largest party, and they beat Chancellor Olaf Scholz to that position. And of course, in France, the National Rally, led by the likes of Jordan Bardella and Marine Le Pen, actually won those European elections, which then provoked President Macron to call national elections. So clearly, I mean, did the centre hold in the European elections? Generally speaking, I think you can say yes, to a certain extent. There was a swing to the right, but it's particularly France and Germany and the picture and outlook there that is quite revealing, and how that will influence EU policy in the next mandate, we will have to see.
Many thanks, Sam. Javier?
I think I don't have anything more to add to what Sam just outlined. That is a brilliant summary of where we are, but I'm keen to get stuck into how it might impact all the digital files that we have coming up, and how I think that the EU might see digital policy in general. But I guess maybe you want to first of all tackle the election results. So I guess I'll hand it over to Louis in case he has anything extra to say. But I don't have any more insights that I can contribute to what I think has been a very hard squeezed lemon on all the results and all the political landscape. I think people are the center holding with a bit of sparkling far right sentiment on it. Yeah, would be the summary.
Yeah, thank you, Javier. We will revert to DMA obviously in the second round. But Louis, what are your general reflections on the result?
I think Sam's put it together very nicely. The centre has held. The right extreme is stronger. I think the question going forward is not who will hold power. The centre will have the votes that it needs, and as long as it sort of sticks together, it will be able to push through its agenda. I think it is whether or not the parties on the right can unify in some form to really punch their full weight and don't fight amongst themselves. There are a lot of differences between these parties. I mean, they are often nationalist parties that have their national interests at heart, and surprise, surprise, that nations are the interests of one nation and not the interests of another nation. So can they glue together to actually form some sort of cogent body that manages to push through its ideas? And then secondly, even though the centre has held or will hold, it's still going to have to deal with this loud, perhaps sometimes shouty voice that's no longer on the fringes, but is very much going to be in all of the committees and the parliaments, and going to have possibly commissioners at the European Commission. These are not people that can be ignored. Now, the centre might still have the numbers to force its agenda forward, but it's not going to be able to do so without ignoring the loud and slightly shouty debate that will ensue.
Thank you, Lewis. And the second question, of course, is more focused on the Digital Markets Act and the overall atmosphere underpinning the enforcement of this newly emerged area of law. Sam, let's start with you again.
Yes, so I mean, of course, DMA enforcement is firmly in the hands of the European Commission. So the role the European Parliament plays at this point in the life of the policy is more of an advocacy one than anything else. But there are a couple of interesting points to consider in that context. The political leadership of the European Commission, of course, is very, very important indeed. And in the coming weeks and months, those top jobs in the European Commission will be divvied up, and we'll have a better idea of who those political voices will be in the College of Commissioners who will be responsible for enforcing the DMA. Now, of course, at one point, it's a technocratic enterprise, DMA enforcement, but it is largely driven by the vision of a competitive and fair digital economy. And that vision, of course, emanates from the office of the Commissioner in charge. To date, we've had Margrethe Vestager, the EU Competition Commissioner, and Thierry Breton, the EU Internal Market Commissioner, responsible for making their mark on DMA enforcement. And I suppose speaking generally, Vestager has been good at embedding certain buzzwords into the collective vernacular of competition policy experts, you know, things like level playing field, fairness and contestability in digital markets, etc. And all of these types of principles play out in the enforcement decisions that the European Commission makes. And it's an open question, Oleś, at the moment. We simply don't know what the Commission's vision for DMA enforcement will be going into the next mandate. It depends who those commissioners are, whether Breton stays on, who replaces Margrethe Vestager. These are open questions. So it's guesswork at the moment from the side of the Commission anyway. Parliament, after those European elections, we have a bit more of a clearer picture of the voices that will be heard and that will be pressing the Commission for action when it comes to DMA enforcement. And there were some big names and familiar faces that managed to hold on to their seats. The parliamentary godfather of the DMA, Andreas Schwab, is back in town for his, I believe it's his 5th term in the European Parliament now, which is quite a long amount of time. Stéphanie Yoncourtin, the French liberal, was lucky enough to hold on to her seat. And so was the socialist René Repasse in Germany. So these are 3 very big and very influential names in the European Parliament who will no doubt spend the next few years as part of the forthcoming mandate pressing the Commission to do more when it comes to DMA enforcement. But it's important, just to reiterate that point, Parliament plays merely an advocacy role now. You know, the writing of letters, the meeting with commissioners, the decision makers are still to be decided upon.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Javier, what is your reading about the future of or prediction about the future of the Digital Markets Act enforcement regime?
I think first big picture, I came to Brussels 5 years ago when they were doing the parliamentary hearings, and now I'm lucky enough to be just looking at the bit that I missed in that transition. And what I can see is that everything changes, but everything stays the same. So the hard core bone structure of the heavy-handed bureaucracy of officials behind the cherry on top of whoever is going to be the next commissioner is largely the same. And so there's a massive continuation. I've been speaking to officials, asking them this very same question. And you know, the people who will brief the next commissioner for competition and digital, you know, are not by and large just there in the services. And as Samuel was saying, we have these key political figures in the parliament. So the thinking would be that applying pressure for the commission to do things. So one thing that I can see is that when we see the next person taking questions from Schwab and others in the parliament before their appointment, they will want to come already with some wins. So they will have behind them a case against one or two or multiple gatekeepers under the DMA after they open, in March, this sort of finding to see whether, I forget the term now, but to see whether the gatekeepers are complying with the DMA or not. So we will see for sure by the time this person is in front of the MEPs, they will be able to tell them we have already opened a case against A, B, or C company, and so that they show that there is continuation. I think the journey that I have seen as well. So at the beginning, I was writing about digital policy, and it was the peak of the years of the FT where I had all the front pages. Because people realized that during COVID, we were at the mercy of technology giants and their apps and options so that we could communicate. But then, sadly, for a digital policy correspondent, the war and energy prices and inflation were a gift handed to the people who were driving the policy regulation by their own admission, because the eyes were taking off digital policy completely, because there were other fires that people at the top were putting out. And so as a result, the number of front pages that I have had in recent years have also diminished, sadly. And I think that we will see an increase sort of phasing out and lack of interest in anything that is digital policy, which of course I shouldn't be talking down my own game, but sadly that's the way I see things going. It's going to be about implementation, the most boring, horrible name you can mention to a news editor in London.
Amazing. Luis, you among other things, obviously there are two punchlines from two previous speakers. It's difficult to add something else. Maybe you can also complement your answer with reflections on this amazing series which you did with Let's Talk Competition within Digicomp. What you communicate with them on a daily basis. What is your feeling? How excited they are with the elections and how important these changes will be?
I think the elections have come at a really tricky time for the European Commission, and particularly competition policy in general, and digital policy. As Javier explained, it's a lot was done. 5 years worth of lawmaking, 10 years worth of cases, and there's some fatigue, some exhaustion in the companies, in the regulators, in the possibly the courts as well. And the elections come at a time when there are huge question marks about regulation, and not just competition policy, and digital policy, but more generally, what should the EU be driving for? Competitiveness, security, strategic autonomy, buzzwords. And the new setup of the European Parliament, and therefore the jobs that will be handed out, as Sam explained, will be crucial to finding this new regulatory direction. As ever, when there's been a whole load of lawmaking, what happens is people say we need a period of enforcement, or the ugly word Javier uses, implementation. People are tired of laws, and it's time to actually get the ones we've got working, to see what happens. That, as Sam said, sidelines the European Parliament somewhat. It also poses questions for the European Commission in what structure should they have to enforce these laws. Do you need a separate department for the DSAs and the DMAs and the AI Acts and everything else that's coming down the pathway? So I think there are some pretty big questions. The European Commission is feeling pretty squeezed. There aren't very many fans of competition policy at the moment, or competition policy as it's become known over the last 15, 20 years. People don't speak up for it. There's no constituency of people who vote for competition policy. Consumers don't tend to talk up about it. Companies certainly don't, or only when it's in their interest because they're complaining about a rival. Member states are pretty down on it at the moment, or the large ones are, and the small ones occasionally group together to send letters. it is a tricky time. And that's why I think the European Commission at the moment is trying to up its communications through events and reports and speeches and so forth to try to remind people what competition policy has done in the past and that it should be part of the solution, because I think, you know, the daggers are out. The daggers are out for it in the next mandate. And we will all have our eyes on these mission letters that come to the various commissioners telling you, right, you've got 5 years of your new job, and I'd like you to keep these principles in mind. And what principles will those be? Will they be the same sort of quasi-religious attachment to level playing fields and free markets and so forth, or will they be a greater emphasis placed on things like technological sovereignty and strategic autonomy and all the other buzzwords? So I think it's a pretty dangerous moment for competition policy at the moment.
Let us continue with these buzzwords. And we know in academic cycles, at least 10, 15, 20 years ago, these were completely taboo in competition, for competition law, economics, and policy discussion. Mentioning industrial policy was completely, you know, toxifying your profile. Now it's getting more and more mainstream. So what are your reflections? Do you think it's just coincidence that it's a nice slogan to be operationalized for election purposes, or there is more robust, mature underpinning? And because the need is obvious, but how to do it? Is there any way to do it without shifting towards radicalism or some protectionism or some other vulgarist forms? Do you sense there is an understanding of more mature, mainstream, harmonious coexistence of competition and industrial policy? Samuel?
Well, it's certainly a very interesting question that's being discussed about incessantly here in Brussels. I'm not sure if this argument, and what we're fundamentally talking about here, is a difference between competition and competitiveness and the contrasting visions around that dynamic. Does it ring true with European voters? Does it sort of, is this something that is circulating out there in order to get people to the ballot boxes and to tick particular choices on the list? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it really rings with the milkman from Marseille or the butcher from Bavaria or whatever, really. I don't think industrial policy so far has filtered through society to the extent by which now it's something that voters really, really care about. So I think a lot of the institutions have quite a tough task on their hand over the next few years and into the next mandate in showing consumers why these things actually matter. One thing, of course, a lot of journalists are looking at is who will be driving this new era of European Union industrial policy, the political leadership. And one thing that we're particularly keen on finding a bit more about is, of course, Mario Draghi's upcoming report on competitiveness in the European Union. And there have been some sort of tidbits out there as to his vision and how he thinks the Commission should take things going forward. We know that Draghi has sort of employed this Macronian leitmotif of buy European, and he's supportive of a buy European agenda, which could result in, you know, greater public procurement contracts going to European companies. And he also backs the idea of more subsidies going into European industries and greater tariffs on trade from outside the European Union, particularly on goods that seek to undercut European products. You know, there have been many examples of economic dumping from third countries over the year, and of course, particularly now, China is the main focus of EU regulators in that regard. I think it will be interesting to see how broadly this policy is rolled out across European industries and sectors. Draghi himself says that there is a need to get energy prices down for consumers. He basically says we pay far too much for energy, particularly when compared to our to the United States, etc. He also says our tech industries haven't grown to the extent that they should have done when you compare it with the US and China. So we have a picture of the problems, and going into the next mandate, the discussion will be, well, what are the solutions to those problems? In practice, at this stage, it's largely playing guesswork, but we could look to increase efficiencies across these sectors, energy and tech particularly, in order to spur growth by more money in research and development, production, and the cultivation of next generation technologies that will help to allow the European Union's industries to grow on a level playing field, if you like, with the US and China. I mean, it's no easy feat. It's something that will take a long, long time. And the risk is here. It could eventually compromise competition on the internal market. So the tension here, excuse me, between competition and competitiveness is one that's really going to be pushed to the breaking point, I feel, in the next mandate. It's sort of started in this mandate. There's been a certain degree of resistance, particularly from the office of Margareta Vestager, to embarking on this gun-ho subsidy splash across a number of European sectors, despite the sort of implicit understanding that these state aid requests come into the European Commission and they're sort of rubber stamped at breakneck speed. And indeed, those state aid rules were loosened during COVID and then again in the war in Ukraine. But the tension is there, and it's just all about application as we go into the next mandate.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Javier?
The CEO of Ericsson, arguably one of the very few notable tech companies in Europe, likes to say that Europe is good for museums and for good wine. And I think he's partly right. And, obviously it's a caricature just to highlight an issue. But I see NVIDIA, making the robots of the future for like 10,000. So a little bit around the price of a Tesla. Sorry, I don't know what the price of a Tesla is. I do know that the price of the pint of milk. But anyway, just jokes aside, just to say, the US, is speeding ahead with, personal robots, and it's very concretely a company growing in size. China has been coming into Europe and using subsidies to penetrate the European industries, while the EU has been tying itself in knots with rules. This is the bad news. The good news is that I think that they are waking up quite fast. One set of rules that I think it's quite powerful that we have been writing about is the foreign subsidies regulation. Already, Chinese companies have pulled out of bids for European continents to build factories. They've, now they're scrutinizing mergers, something that they've not done before. So they're sort of equalizing the ground so that Europe can also compete with Chinese players. I think that we will see a real push for this idea of European champions. With the people that we all talk to, they are extremely worried about a very strong shift. We're about to lose a strong, whatever you think about Margaret Vestager, she has been there for like a decade. So she has established herself as super strong commissioner with very clear ideas and of how to do things. Inevitably, whoever replaces her, they will be new, no matter how much political weight they have. And I think this is a great opportunity for the usual countries that push for this industrial policy to advance this idea of European champions. The EU is on the becoming irrelevant and just being the Disneyland of the world. So I think that they will really, really push for this industrial policy, and I can see it. I was commenting it a few days ago. I've never seen so many events organized by DG Comp once more than in the last few years to hear about how competition policy, let's make competition policy great again, because it shows that they are really, really worried.
Thank you very much, Javier. Luis?
Yeah, I think that there used to be opposites. One was not put in the same sentence as the other, if only to contrast. Now, I think the competition policy people have realized they have to swim with the current, and the current is for industrial policy. The current is for a more realistic, pragmatic, some would say protectionist, some would say interventionist, whatever approach to commercial policy. You can see that happening in the trade domain as well in a very, very big way, and competition policy has to swim with that current. And so they have put great efforts into rescoping competition policy as part of the solution, not as a contrast. It helps resilience. If resilience is another one of these buzzwords, markets should be stronger to withstand shocks. And the way you withstand a shock is you don't be dependent on a single supplier, because then you're in real trouble. Or that you can switch. Competitive markets are stronger markets, so therefore competition policy serves resilience. That's the way that the argument goes. So I think the competition policy people have had to get savvy. They know that industrial policy is here to stay for the next generation. I think political generation. We're going to see it in things like technological sovereignty. In the past, competition policy would have said we're technology neutral. Let the best device win, let the best patent win, let the best invention win. All innovation is good innovation. Now it's, well, we want certain kinds of technology that are technology of our friends or good technology. We want innovation to be from us and not just from outside. And so it's invariably you're getting into a place where you are, picking winners and losers, and the winners have to be our friends in our part of the world and not in others. And there are some ways that this happens through policy. So you see that with all these acts, critical raw materials acts and inflation reduction acts are all about favoring European outcomes and European actors and businesses. You see it sometimes through, and this goes back to Sam's point about, do people actually care about industrial policy? They don't care about industrial policy writ large, but they do when it is through the lens of something very familiar to them. And that could be a merger of two companies, both of which are massive names in their country because they're massive employers. And then it becomes about employment in a region or the future of the car industry in a particular country. That is a vehicle for this debate, industrial policy clashing with new industrial policy clashing with traditional competition policy. And that, those are the parts which are interesting for people like Sam and Javier and me to follow. And they're the real conduits for this. They're the real battlegrounds for this current debate. And you're seeing it in things like the Lufthansa ITA, Italian Airways transaction.
Thank you very much, Luis. It's extremely difficult to find time which would work for all of us, and we only have 30 plus minutes. So I know we will now have to revert to recommendations to students, but maybe we have time for one quick question, maybe 1 minute each or so.
Yeah.
There are two ways to do it in digital. One is just to acknowledge the status quo in terms of the largest, let's say, gatekeepers, and just try to make them comply and try to force them to be as compliant and as open, transparent, fair, etc. as possible. So it's kind of re-acknowledging the status quo and perceiving them as quasi-public utilities. And another more radical way is to think, okay, it's a game where we need our own infrastructure. It's a game. It's the future of digital. Everything is digital, and Europe would be better off. By Europe, I mean also UK. With its big tech. However caricaturistic and unrealistic this picture appears to be these days, do you see these two positions coexisting somehow in this main decision-making cycles, territories or centers, or one prevails? What is your reading?
Right.
There are other ones.
I think you're right. I mean, the DMA is all about the first of those. The DMA is an acceptance that these companies aren't going anywhere. They're here to stay, and we need to regulate them in a way that is like a utility. We need to ensure that they give fair access conditions. We need to ensure that they don't prefer their own services. So I think that certainly is here, and that I think is now common ground. there may be a push to, there will always be a push to force divestments and stricter interventions into their business models, and maybe they come if some of the companies play a certain game on the DMA and seek conflict there. So I think that's certainly there. On your second part is, does Europe need its own infrastructure? Those kinds of sentences and those kinds of ideas are voiced quite commonly by the likes of Andreas Munt, who talks about a European cloud. When you look at what the European Union is discussing on cybersecurity certification, it's about, sovereignty. It's about renationalizing some of these services. And I don't think, anyone necessarily expects a massive Belgian cloud provider to suddenly appear overnight. But there are ways that Europe is starting to talk about these things and using its own form of power to try to say, longer term, we need some of these services to be European.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. These two dynamics of regulating large technology giants while at the same time attempting to build up your own ones. I think they can happen in parallel. The European Union has got to be very smart with the technologies that it decides to invest in. I mean, the technologies that are popular now will be soon outdated in the coming years and months. And, there's a lot of talk around artificial intelligence. And like Lewis said, particularly cloud industries. I, for one, think that Belgium has enough clouds to do already. Some call it the Brabant gloom, I think, as Roy Jenkins referred to it as, the quantity of clouds in the sky, that is, of course, in Belgium. But yeah, there are certain markets within the technology sector that do need particular attention. So I think AI and cloud are two that stand out. They're not mutually exclusive, these two dynamics of regulating larger technologies and larger technology companies while at the same time trying to build up your own ones. But I think there is a divergence of views into how we do that and how we go about achieving the same results that have given the American tech giants such huge profit margins over recent decades.
One would expect you to continue with suggesting, is there any answers on your side, or it's...
Well, that would be beyond my $1 billion question. I merely observe, Olesh. I don't make policy proposals. Listen, there's a divergence of views out there. I would say true competition is about competing on a level playing field and managing to cultivate a sense of growth in your own organizations and companies to the extent by which you can compete with others fairly. That can be done through a number of different means, investment in research, development, plugging the brain drain gap as well. We have some of the best universities in the world. And one thing that the European Union has suffered for many years is the migration of students across the Atlantic after they've got their qualifications to work in some of these major American or otherwise technology companies. Why can't we keep some of that talent here in Europe? Why can't we use that talent to help drive the next technological innovation in the European Union? I think for me personally, that would be a really, really interesting area for the EU to explore. And they are doing a number of different initiatives in this space. But how can you ensure that the people who drive the next digital revolution and have trained in the European Union stay here? I think that's key for me.
Thank you, Sam. Javier.
Everything that Sam said and that Lewis said, and just to maybe add and end on a positive note, BlackBerry, Napster, Opera, MySpace, these at some point looked like companies that were going to get places, and now they are irrelevant, dead, obsolete. What I'm trying to say is that reality changes all the time. And so the opportunities for the EU to be competitive and advance in digital markets are always there in theory. Like, NVIDIA surpassed Microsoft as the, most valuable company. Nothing is static. And I think that it's not either or. I think you do it with strong rules so that you can detain or slow down the incumbents, and then a massive push to fund put your money where your mouth is and your ideas are, and a massive change in culture of risk, which this continent lacks severely.
Thank you very much. And the last question is your recommendations to students and maybe to academics who want to make their research more visible, and should they what the format which you in the leading prominent media outlets would pay attention at, the substance or format also matters, all the things which you would suggest to us.
Yeah, thanks, Olish. And before I impart my recommendations to the students, just to come back to Javier's point there, which I think is really, really important. He used the word culture. And far be it from me to lean on the musings of the self-proclaimed fascist, but if we go back over 100 years to the writings of Marinetti, for example, in Italy, and the Futurist Manifesto, he, of course, complained that Italy and indeed Europe was some sort of a museum that had failed on the industrial front and needed to enter a new futuristic era of high productivity, high efficiency, innovation, technology, industry. So these aren't new, and it failed then. Of course, we had 2 world wars that perhaps could have stymied progress to a certain extent. But these have been long in the tooth, these types of concerns. The fact that we have sort of been behind for too long when it comes to industrial development, at least for the past 100 years or so. I think the UK is a slightly separate case, and indeed that predates the writings of Marinetti and the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom particularly. But I don't think these are new concerns. I think they've been around for a long, long time. We just need answers. And I think one of the answers is a cultural shift. So a shift in how Europe self-identifies and how it finds its place in the world. I think that's really, really important. So I just wanted to pick up on that point about culture there. Recommendations for students. So I think last year we did this, and I think it was almost exactly a year ago. The headline piece of advice emanated from between the lips of a one Javier Espinoza, who said, "Don't become a journalist." And I think that advice indeed holds true today, and particularly with us entering a new mandate now. And like Javier said earlier, it becomes less about the co-legislative procedure and more about implementation enforcement. For us as journalists, our focus turns to Luxembourg, and the DMA particularly, I think, will be made in Luxembourg. Despite us having a finished text that is in the rule book, I think really we'll have a better understanding of what the DMA actually is as a result of those court challenges in Luxembourg. And I think the first one is coming up soon, actually in July, regarding TikTok's challenge to the rules, which will be very, very interesting. So with that in mind, my recommendation to the students would be to study law, to maybe thinking about entering the legal profession, or maybe supplementing your academic studies with some sort of an interest in working in the legal world. The twain can often be quite good bedfellows, actually, academia and legal work. I remember about 20 years ago, someone recommended me to become a data protection lawyer, and I decided against the advice. It was probably very, very good advice at the time, but I just had too much of a thrust to enter the journalistic world. I don't regret it for 1 second, but it wouldn't be an altogether terrible choice.
So Sam was already very eloquent on the first question, so I'll answer the second one very quickly. You have to change gears and stop thinking like an academic completely. So when you talk to me, the more you talk like an academic, the more you will lose me immediately. We all have rubbish coming through, like a stream of rubbish in everywhere. I thought I had handled managed it well by moving to WhatsApp, a selective number of people. Now WhatsApp has become my inbox, but I also have the inbox. So I have rubbish coming out of my ears. And so if you want to grab my attention, I think if I understood the question correctly, and take your beautiful, crafted, decades-long piece of research, you have to completely change gears and think in bullet points. Give me the setup, the conflict, and the conclusion. Like a movie script. This I took from something I listened to recently about Steve Jobs and the way that he presented things. You have to simplify, dumb it down, and it's probably still very complicated. Just change gears and think in a different way how you can sell this. You know, you're competing with attention and competing in a long stream, a river, a flood of rubbish. So how can you distinguish yourself and make it shine so that people like Sam and myself get interested?
What I'd recommend to students and academics is get your voices out there. We're looking for independent voices in times like this, where there are lots of interests at play, political, corporate. Having the voice of independent academics who've done proper work getting under the bonnet of issues like AI and digital markets is absolutely priceless for us. So get your voice out there, use social media, and make your voices and your views known.
Samuel Stolton, Javier Espinoza, Louis Crofts, thank you very much indeed for sharing your brilliant ideas with all of us.
Pleasure.